will believe anything, especially if someone looks clever and claims to have a degree from an American university. Now, there's shades here of the sort of thing that Mark Twain wrote about, in Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn, the kind of things that happened on the frontiers in the 19th century American West, and I'm sure in many other places as well. Things happen on frontiers with particular frequency. While hardly devoid of invention, millennial faith of parody, much of this recent South African impersonation is a con, desperate and heartless. But not always. More benign forms of self-fashioning conjure with similar ideals, a similar resort to a kind of performative mimesis in order to close the gap between desire and scarce means. The Universal Church of Brazilian origin, for instance, one of the most successful purveyors of the Pentecostal prosperity gospel in Southern Africa, regularly holds services in which youth come dressed as professionals they want to be. Bring them as doctors, bring them as lawyers. The pastor enjoyed his congregation in Cape Town a couple of months ago. If they have faith, God will grant them their wish. Aspiration, the will to self-advancement, flared at the end of apartheid. With liberation came liberalization, with its lingo of enterprise and empowerment for all. What in consultancy speak is called serial entrepreneurship. Chronic unemployment and growing inequality have only spurred the popular obsession with discovering the magic of upward mobility. Telling in this regard was a narrative in the National News column a few months ago entitled Young Voices by a young man called Mtwisa Mvuleni. He was a high school senior from a poor, strife-torn family, and he shared his dream of becoming a lawyer. I have a vision of myself as a magistrate, he confessed. This is a long-standing passion, which used to take me to courts from a very young age, where I could see the magistrates in action. Then he described how he observed their practices for hours, their body gestures, their moves, for hours at a time, vowing that one day he would also sit in that chair. Now, this story shows a kind of unfettered ambition, an impetus towards a kind of mimetic experimental performance in pursuit of a desired identity. This quality is brilliantly captured in a South African film called Hijacked Stories, a film that centers on the struggle of a newly enfranchised black middle-class actor to learn the moves, the dangerous kind of bravado of township youngsters, so he can take the role of a brash criminal in a national soap opera. And the idea here is that criminals again defiantly bridge this gap between the promise and the reality of self-enrichment. Criminality is itself an identity to be learned through copying, the movie tells us. To succeed, it must be convincingly performed. Crime is a performance, the film tells us, but by the same token, performance is also often a kind of crime. Now, not only is imposture especially widespread in South Africa, but fascination with artful self-production seems embedded in the national psyche. In his celebrated 2008 novel, Imposter, the author Damon Galgut probes the unsettling qualities of identity in the South African present. A time, he says, affirming it, when places are renamed, maps are reprinted, and landscapes rendered unreadable. It is a time, Galgut adds, of liberated possibilities and unprecedented deceits, in which conventional signs are suspect and nobody is quite what they appear to be. So it's the other side of the new possibilities, all of this. Flipping false assets, operating under aliases, peddling simulacral identities are all commonplace. So too is plagiarism, the most obvious textual manifestation of the culture of the false copy. Poets, professors, pastors, public intellectuals, scholars, even several heads of universities have been accused of it in recent years. If liberation unleashed seductive new prospects, it also erased sovereign certainties, making it harder to tell truth from deception. The criteria are all in flux. But here's the question. Is the story an exotic southern exception? Or does it bespeak something more universal? about world making in our current epoch. A time that, according to David Graeber, has seen a great burst of interest, both theoretical and practical, in the notion of performance itself. And one thinks about the role of performance in the efforts of American economists to try and re-establish security and confidence in the economy after the 2008 collapse. We must perform, and confidence will follow. To be sure, as we noted earlier, modernist self-making has always been haunted by the spectre of artifice, authenticity, and duplicity. But the South African situation involves something more. Not just a concern with slippage in a time of flux between public science and personal identities, or a preoccupation with the semiotics of recognition. What is remarkable here is the sheer profusion of impostors in all walks of life, ordinary and elevated. If imposture in early modern France, of Nathalie Zeeman Davis, was at the extreme end of a continuum of self-making, it was a capital offence after all there, it was a sin against God, actually. In South Africa, it has become a common everyday practice. As such, it reveals something significant about the disjuncture in this context between desire and achievability, ends and means. Impostors make poignantly plain how precarious is the work of realizing viable personhood, of building intimate intersubjective worlds that might sustain it. In this context, fakery seems hugely productive by comparison to most above-board alternatives, if only in the short term. And who has the luxury and the patience to think of the longer term? The pretender then, the imposter, serves as a potent parody of the incitement to aspire, to accumulate, to find new ways of making poverty history, these things that people are constantly being told now they have the right to do. Let us return in this respect to the case of the imposter Maskandi. The rebirth of Khulekani Khumalo mobilized a clutch of cultural reference and biographical facts, couched in the ties of kinship and affinity, in the traffic between the living and the dead, and in the hazards of occult ill will and revenge. Although he died in Johannesburg, where he had pursued most of his career, Khulekani came back to the homestead in which he was raised, there to present himself to those able to affirm his identity, his paternal and maternal kin, and his conjugal partners. In doing so, the would-be prodigal reenacted an iconic journey, the movement between the workplace and rural household that, as anthropologist Hilton White has noted, has long linked black wage labour to the building of domestic units, the founding of families, and the securing of social personhood, and with it ancestral recognition. The alleged imposture of Babashi, then, was not merely an effort to usurp the career and the value accruing to it of the famous musician. It is an attempt to occupy a place in a network of relations, of identity, patrimony, reciprocity, stretching back to the past and reaching forward to the future. And this question of attaining a future is a huge issue on the part of people who do not know how to get from today to tomorrow. Babashi, if it indeed is he, claims, you will remember, that he was snatched from this world by witchcraft, that zombies obliterated his identity, commanding him to live a living death. Now, zombies as figures of the imagination took on new relevance just as the liberalization of the South African economy was making itself felt in proletarian communities, as labor became increasingly casualized, as millions of jobs were lost, and as manufacture and mining were radically restructured. The popular expectation that, with the end of apartheid, the state would address the problem of rampant inequality soon faded. Instead, the country was caught up in the paradox of jobless growth. In the 1990s, zombies were often associated explicitly with a relatively sudden appearance of new wealth in otherwise unpromising conditions. Wealth whose sources was obscure. They were held to be phantom workers who seemed to have sucked the life out of real workers, undermining the labour market and the world it supported. And I'm not only talking here about popular beliefs, but I'm talking about artists and poets and filmmakers and people who use this image to try and capture what was happening in the economy. Zombies signaled a disruption in the flow of value that once sustained domestic life. Bereft of wages, households now survive on a rough mix of social grants and informal enterprise, both of which foreground women, thus depriving many males of the means of becoming full adults, of marrying, and of establishing families. Employment here remains the sine qua non of dignified masculinity, but under existing conditions it is receding possibility for more and more men, forcing the birth of new economies that capitalize more or less on the residues, the detritus of the past, which is where the Maskanda music tradition comes in. It was a byproduct of the migrant labor system, having been incubated in worker hostels of the swelling industrial cities in the 1920s, from where it travelled back to the countryside when the men went home with their wages. The music was a dynamic, evolving synthesis, blending diverse influences from Zulu courting songs to Afrikaans folk liedjies, using cheap store-bought guitars and concertinas. One of the defining features was Zulu praise poetry, redeployed to give expression to a new sense of personhood, ushered in by the male migrant career. The anthropologist David Copland sees Maskanda as part of a larger category of African identity practices that were born on the road, in the restless journey between the country and the city, peasantry and proletariat, past and present. As the century progressed, Maskanda evolved in symbiosis with a cultural mix of urban working class life. While it would acquire a more formal identity as Zulu traditional music during apartheid, in the post-colony it displays a renewed vitality, shedding many of its parochial connotations to resonate with consumer-oriented urban audiences and ethno-modern identities. As such, the genre has acquired intensified heft as heritage capital, as intellectual property, in a climate in which the sale of culture has to a greater or lesser extent replaced the sale of labour in many communities. Successful Maskandi, the ghosts of workers past, can bring in serious money. Kulikani seems to have perfected a persona and a crossover style that offered sleek tradition for the city listener and an ethnicized urbanity in the countryside. His popular CDs and videos vary in theme